I'm Audra Langley, as Taylor mentioned, and really over the next hour, we won't be doing a deep dive, but we will be doing an overview of childhood adversity, trauma, healing, and resilience, particularly in the context of child welfare. And in addition to, I can see people already dropping in names and majors. Thank you so much. Looks like we've got some great diversity here. Oh, I love this. And I'd also really love to hear just how everyone's feeling today. Just if you can choose one word, you probably have 12, but one word, if you can kind of let me know right now how you're feeling in the moment, so I can sort of also tend to judge where we're at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you. Still reading through the chat. Appreciate you all. So if you can just take a moment just to add one word how you're feeling today. I'm feeling hopeful that I'm going to be able to provide an overview in 1 hour of this material. And okay, I'll stop at that. I have some other feelings, but we'll stick with one. All right, great, thank you. And don't feel like you have to say you're feeling great or hopeful. No judgment. You can be completely honest. Yes, thank you. Okay, I'm seeing some honesty. Appreciate that. Not that you all aren't being honest. Really good. I appreciate that. And most of the times, as we talk about with kids, we have double dip feelings. We have all sorts of mixed feelings at the same time, and we can hold them all together. Okay, all right. Some of these I have questions about, so I wish we had more time. But yeah, love that. Appreciate that. Very good. Thank you all. So this is, again, an overview session of what we're going to be talking about today. And I do want to also have a brief disclosure, as Taylor mentioned, and that is that both with Dr. Wong's talk and with mine, when we're talking about adversity and trauma, and quite frankly, even about healing and resilience, and particularly around abuse and neglect, it can be intense. And so please feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If you need to get up and walk away from the screen or turn down the speaker, if you need to get a glass of water, if you need to move your body in some way, please feel free to do that. We want to make sure that everyone is taking care of themselves this afternoon as well. So we will jump right in. Can I get either a virtual raise of hands or a literal raise of hands? And I'll actually try to go through the images of who has heard of the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Okay. Okay, so it looks like a fair number of you. So some of you definitely have, okay, more hands are coming up. Excellent, thank you. So I'd like us to watch a brief video. Is everyone able to see the screen? Can everyone see my slides? Okay, I'd like us to watch a brief video that provides, I think, a well-done explanation of the original Adverse Childhood Experience study and also some more recent thoughts about it. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear?
Doctors Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda published groundbreaking research assessing the links between childhood adversity and adult health and well-being. In the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study, known as the ACE study, 17,000 mostly white, mostly middle-class adults were asked about 10 different types of childhood adversity. When you were a child, were you physically or psychologically abused by parents? Did you live with someone who abused drugs? Were you neglected? Was there domestic violence? Did anyone go to prison? Was someone in your home mentally ill? Respondents were assigned one ACE for each of the 10 types of adversity experienced. Surprisingly, more than 1 in 5 of this mostly middle-class population reported 3 or more ACEs. But even more eye-opening was the correlation between childhood adversity and adult mental and physical health.
The higher the ACE score, the more likely people were to suffer from things like heart disease, liver disease, lung disease. Depression, suicide, IV drug abuse, and alcoholism. What it said was, we've got to common causality for all of our major health and social problems. And it was all related to what had happened to them as children.
But researchers like Dr. Roy Wade could see the ACE study didn't take into account economic distress, let alone hunger, housing insecurity, and other hardships in low-income neighborhoods.
When I came to Philadelphia and I saw the huge amount of blight, the community violence, the episodes of racism and discrimination, those are stressors too.
When Philadelphia researchers expanded the ACE survey to add questions about racism, neighborhood safety, and violence outside the home, they discovered that while 14% of the general population reported 4 or more ACEs, in Philadelphia, that number was a startling 37%.
Poverty is an adverse childhood experience that gets under the skin. Living in economic distress can actually translate into long-term negative health outcomes, even for the most resilient individuals.
So Dr. Wade is talking about a community in Philadelphia, but certainly we know that this is true for a number of under-resourced and highly impacted communities across the country and really globally. And so one of the things he reflects on is what wasn't asked, right? What did we not ask about in the adverse childhood experience study? And so does anyone want to share in the chat or come off of mute and share some of the things that Dr. Wade was expressing? They're also on the slide. Exactly, food insecurity and hunger. Thank you, Coley. And really structural vulnerability, systemic racism, dealing with daily discrimination, marginalization, and other things that I think a lot of folks think about, and that is access to mental health services, to health services, to economic services and supports. And so other pieces that many of you probably in your fields are talking about in your own ecological models that really are at play here when we think about children and young people and families. And in your fields, I wonder, do you call it social determinants, structural determinants? What terminology are you all using in your studies and in your fields right now? I think most of you are probably learning something about, yeah, okay. Social determinants. Oftentimes we also are thinking about structural determinants and competency. And again, this says social determinants of health, but it's really social determinants of well-being, of mental health, of access. There's so many pieces here. And for all of us today in this Zoom room together, you know, thinking about all the variables within our own social determinants of health and well-being, you know, maybe it might be nice for us to each just kind of think about these for a moment, and which of these were most salient in building who we are, what has brought us to this point, even overcoming some issues related to these variables or inequities. And so I think it's really important that we think about this broader context before we then start to think about adversity and trauma and even healing. Another important thing that was not asked about when we think about adverse childhood experiences is what about positive childhood experiences? What about all of those buffering factors and relationships and strengths that exist for children within their families, their neighborhoods, their communities, collectively, as well as other places in their environment that we saw in that last depiction? And it's really important, I think, that we move from just these deficit-based questions to these strength-based questions as well. So SAMHSA defines trauma based on the 3 E's. So trauma is something that an individual experiences. So it's an event, or it's in a series of events or circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. In some sense, it's overwhelming to that individual, and that has lasting adverse effects on functioning. And this could be mental or physical functioning, social, emotional, spiritual well-being. And all of this is very individual, right? Because we all experience or perceive an event very differently. We all have different resources and coping strategies within our repertoire that would lead to us feeling overwhelmed, threatened, or not. And we also, that can impact the effects and how long they endure after we've experienced a traumatic event. So trauma is similar, but defined a bit more distinctly than adversity or stress. This is a list that's not meant to be exhaustive, but these are some traumatic experiences. I wonder if you could help me in the chat, just sort of list, maybe it is some of these events or other types of traumatic experiences that you hear a lot about in what you're studying, in your own community, etc. So some of these might be familiar, and there may be other traumatic experiences. Maybe for a moment, if we could just share other traumatic experiences that you hear about a lot, or perhaps it's some of these. I think there's a delay in my chat. There we go. So again, housing instability. Absolutely. Immigration, separation from guardians with border crossing, intergenerational trauma. Thank you. Absolutely. So there are a series of different types of traumatic events. Again, many are listed here. And thinking about it, what is traumatic can be experienced in a very different way for each individual. And the other thing is that it's quite additive. I think people are oftentimes, when they start to look at the literature on trauma, are really surprised to find that when we're working, even with early elementary age children, it is not uncommon that children, 6 to 11 years old, have already experienced multiple traumatic events, that oftentimes it isn't just one event, but multiple experiences that they've had even at a young age. And certainly by the time that young people reach adolescence, that experience is even more common. And I don't have time today, but I would love to at some point share some of our data, even from our Los Angeles school districts, just around the incredible prevalence and impact of trauma, and more than that, the tremendous resilience of our young people. So kids are experiencing traumatic events, and they're still showing up in all these venues, but it doesn't mean that they aren't experiencing intrusive thoughts about what they've been through, reminders or flashbacks, that they aren't trying to avoid situations that remind them of what they have experienced, right? Or that cause undue stress, that they have a lot of hypervigilance and worry about when's the next bad thing going to happen. They have physiological arousal because of that, and that it can lead to some negative cognitions around their own longevity, around their own safety, feeling like they are unprepared to handle themselves, or unworthy or deserving of traumatic events that they've experienced. I'm sharing a couple of drawings here from children. You can see there's a variety of ways in which children experience trauma. It can be within their own families, in their communities. This is a third grader whose father was shot and killed. The first was a fourth grader who was experiencing domestic violence in her home and community violence in our neighborhoods, as this sixth grader shares in his drawing. And so there are multiple types of trauma. Oftentimes what we're familiar with is an acute trauma that many of us may have experienced. This is something that may happen only once. It could be like a severe car accident. It could be a natural disaster, earthquakes like we have here in California. It can also be something, you could have multiple acute events, but each one is experienced as an individual trauma. Chronic types of trauma tend to occur over time. So this would be some type of ongoing traumatic event. Could be something like experiencing domestic violence over time. Complex trauma is similar to chronic trauma in that complex trauma is multiple traumatic events. It can be the same or different events. It's happening over time, typically for children and young people during those developmental periods. And a key aspect of complex trauma is that many times the trauma is committed by somebody who you rely upon for trust and for care. So it's a loss of trust, it's a betrayal. So this could be things like ongoing sexual abuse, physical abuse that might be compounded by other traumatic experiences as well. And historic intergenerational trauma. So this is the type of trauma that's experienced collectively by a group of people, and that we know also can have intergenerational impacts and effects over time. These are things like in the history of enslaved people in the US and their ongoing impacts. These are things like the Holocaust, etc. We know that the emotional impact of trauma can be profound, and many of you have probably heard about post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll tell you why I'm going to focus less on that specific diagnosis today in the next slide, but it certainly can be quite common that young people develop post-traumatic stress disorder following exposure to a trauma, one or more. And we know that when someone's experienced trauma, it also interferes with our ability to relate to others. It impacts our relationships and our ability to trust others. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about healing today. It also can lead to behavioral problems. And many times with children and young people, this is what you're going to hear about because it's what's visible. Right? Doesn't mean there's not a lot of things happening under the surface, but oftentimes what is noticed is the behavior. And this also can lead to some self-medicating through substance use. We might notice more aggression and impulsivity because children and young people might already be revved up. And then we also might notice some internalizing symptoms, things like being more anxious or withdrawn or isolated, and also some depressive symptoms that for young children can also look like irritability. Obviously, kids spend a lot of time in school, right? I'm not sure how many of you are in education, but certainly we're all in education ourselves in one way or the other and have been through it. So thinking about a child or a young person in school, knowing that it would be normative after experiencing trauma, that there would be difficulty concentrating, that I might have intrusive thoughts of something that happened at home last night or in my neighborhood 3 months ago, or something that's happened chronically over time, and that might jump into my head, or I might have a flashback in the middle of the 8 hours I'm in school, trying to learn, trying to engage with peers, etc. And we also know that trauma can really impact us in ways that make us want to avoid things that either remind us of what we've experienced or create anxiety that has generalized because of what we've been through. Does that make sense? Okay. So we know that the impact can be profound. I tend, and most tend to emphasize PTSD itself less than really talking about child traumatic stress, because what we've learned over time is that even for children and young people who don't meet full diagnostic criterion for post-traumatic stress disorder, their impairment and their functioning, right, at school, with their family, with their peers, their extracurriculars, their functioning is impaired at a similar level to those who might have full-blown PTSD. So it's important that we really talk about child traumatic stress without needing to require a diagnosis, etc. I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact of trauma on our brains. And our brains are fascinating. And they certainly, one of the things they're set up to do is to help keep us safe in the context of threat and stress and trauma. And so many of you might have seen this model. I know Bruce Perry and many others do a great explanation of this model, but I'm going to use the model of our hand. So most of you are not on screen, which is fine, but if you can hold your hand up in your own spaces and imagine that this bottom part of your hand under your palm, this is your brain stem. And so this is a very primitive part of our brain. It's not conscious. It's what's enabling all of us right now to regulate our digestion, our heart rate, our breathing. All of those things are very primitive and instinctual, and they occur within our brain stem. And if you lay your thumb across your hand in this way, your thumb represents your limbic system. And your limbic system is really the emotional or the feeling part of your brain. And within our limbic system exists our amygdala, which is what's triggered when we perceive threat. Okay, it's what triggers, as you'll see in a moment, our fight, flight, or freeze response. And our hippocampus also is within this middle brain, the limbic system. And if you wrap your fingers around your brain, you can see this is an incredibly well-designed brain, and your fingers represent your prefrontal cortex. And this is the rational part of our brain that enables us to stop and think about things. It's where our executive functioning lives. I know that's kind of a buzzword in a lot of spaces. And so this is a very thoughtful, planning, rational part of our brain. Now, our prefrontal cortex continues to develop all the way into our late 20s. So for me, my ship has sailed, okay, for the prefrontal cortex. But for some of you, you actually may still be continuing to develop connections within your prefrontal cortex, okay? Because it develops over time at certain ages, it's really difficult for kids and young people to access those connections, but they're building over time. However, when our limbic system is triggered, it disconnects from our prefrontal cortex because it's in protection mode. So this is a survival brain. This is survival mode, okay? This is not a learning brain, and this is not a good relationship brain. It's a protection brain. And so because of that, everything's happening autonomically in terms of your heart rate and slowing of digestion and all of those things that will happen to keep us safe because of this trigger. So the more situations that we can create where individuals feel safe and they do not feel threatened, then they're able to connect with their whole brain. Hopefully that makes sense. So our stress response system is set up so that when something frightening occurs, that our amygdala releases chemicals that help our body respond to this potential threat, right? And then we respond with our fight, flight, or freeze response. And following such an event, the hippocampus then creates a very potent memory that becomes embedded about that event, that significant event. And so these changes are actually very helpful in the face of danger. What happens is that when people continuously are experiencing threat or danger, and even when it's not a new threat, but it's a reminder, the same physiological process occurs where the amygdala releases those chemicals to respond to the threat, and we have the fight, flight, or freeze response. And over time, that can really impact our hippocampus in a negative way. And so here, what I'm saying is there's nothing wrong with these brains. Our brains are doing exactly what they were designed to do, to keep us safe, right, in the face of threat or danger. The problem lies when we're always in that phase, when children and young people are consistently being in situations where they either are under threat or having trauma reminders from what they've experienced. And that can, again, lead to less connection with prefrontal cortex and really cause indiscriminate fear where everything feels unsafe. So I would like to share a video that I think does a good job of trying to explain how a stress response in early childhood continues to impact us. And I think as we're watching it, we could also think of examples with older children and young people as well. And even though their reactions might look different at different developmental levels, we can sort of see how it makes sense given the context of youth's experience.
The stressors many children face day to day in neglected communities like North Philadelphia can be relentless.
we can really manage a lot of stressors. If we are crossing the street and we see that a truck is coming at us, we can manage that situation, get scared, jump, and move quickly. Unfortunately, many children in our society feel like a truck is coming at them all day long for more days than not. And this really takes a toll.
We know from a new body of research that exposure to chronic stress early in life can lead to actual changes in brain architecture.
The child's development is affected by chronic stress. The impact of the chemicals that are released as a result of stress, that kind of unrelenting drip, drip, drip that affects then the way the brain develops. So language functions, the ability to think clearly, the ability to focus, to organize thoughts, all of that is being laid down in very early childhood. When a child is exposed to toxic stress, then the brain is not connecting the way it should.
Especially toxic for children can be exposure to conflict or violence in the home.
I remember having a little 2-ish, 3-ish year old child who was hitting their baby doll. Well, they didn't make that up. Even if they weren't in the room when the domestic violence occurred, when the physical violence occurred, they still feel those effects very, very deeply.
They are perceiving the world as dangerous all the time and defending against those feelings by becoming aggressive.
They may have the history of what happened. They may have feelings about what happened, fear, sadness, anger. They may have no words for these feelings. And then they have these behaviors. But they really do not connect all of them. They don't know that because this happened, I developed these feelings that make me behave this way.
And for many of us who serve children, we don't make those connections either. A 2005 study reported the number of children expelled from preschool for behavioral problems at 3 times the expulsion rate for K-12 students. In 2012, in Connecticut alone, 2,000 children 6 years and under, overwhelmingly Black and Latino, were suspended from kindergarten and preschool, dramatically increasing their risk of dropping out later and being sent to prison. Instead of labeling them as bad kids, why don't we see them as children facing adversities that other children don't? Why are we re-traumatizing young people who are already traumatized?
There was a lot in that video, so I want to acknowledge that. I wonder if any of you either can just jot down for yourselves, or if you're comfortable, share in the chat with us any just thoughts or reactions from the video, or things that you may think about differently, given what we heard. Again, you're welcome to share in the chat. You're welcome to come off mute, or just jot something down for yourself. So James mentions in the chat around intergenerational trauma, and Taylor shares, it makes you realize how much our kids are, how much they're up against, and how much insight it requires from all of us engaging with children and young people to understand behaviors in that context, as was described. Not just seeing the behaviors as difficult. or disruptive, but understanding how it might make sense given a child's context. Thank you. Kim is sharing about, and oftentimes people are surprised by those statistics and aren't aware that more children are expelled from preschool than they are from even elementary and high school. And we experience that a lot working with children in child welfare. Because of the trauma they've been through, behaviors are not understood in context. They are labeled as difficult or disruptive, and they are expelled oftentimes from preschool. We see it all the time. Thank you so much. Yes, someone mentions behavior is communication, and trauma does make shifts in the brain that of course then impact behavior and other things. Yeah, having mental health in schools and how critical that is. Thank you for that too, Jessica. So what we know, given with, this is something just for us to think about, given what we've talked about so far, thinking about adverse childhood experiences, social determinants of health, and the impacts of trauma that we've learned about just in this short time. Keeping all of that in mind, let's now imagine a child who's had these types of experiences, and now they're going to enter foster care. Okay? These are the kids that we work with in child welfare. Now, what is the additional impact that will become interwoven in this child's life narrative? What is the additional adversity or trauma or loss that comes up being placed in the child welfare system? Please, again, please feel free to come off mute, share in the chat. Yes, they're separated from their families. Thank you. They've been removed from birth family, from extended family potentially, unless they're placed with a family member. And this can happen over and over again. Okay, so you're removed from one family, you're moved to another family. There can be multiple placements over time. Yeah, Anna adds a sense of abandonment. They're changing not only families, remember, and homes, but schools, their everyday routine. It's mentioned that conflict within the new family comes up, right? So there's new rules to learn, there's new conflict, and tremendous loss that often goes unresolved in child welfare. And so I've lost my caregivers, all of my family, my friends, my teachers, my coaches, religious figures in my life, my neighborhood. Oftentimes there's loss, obviously, of everything familiar. Think about that. Think about when you were a child, were you attached to any of your toys, your stuffed animals, your bedding, your pets? All of that is a huge loss that can again happen over and over again. And loss of one's identity, one's language, one's culture and neighborhood. In addition, now I'm involved in a court system. Okay, so on top of all the other things we already talked about, now we're adding this. I have no privacy. Everyone's talking about my business in this courtroom. And sometimes maybe someone's asking me, and sometimes I don't feel involved. I don't have control over those decisions. There can even be changes in relationships with social workers and knowing who to talk to and who to trust and having to tell your story over and over and over again. And as someone mentioned, there can be ongoing trauma, abuse, or neglect that occurs when a child is moved to live with a relative or with a foster care provider. And imagine what all of this does in terms of shifting my view of myself in the world, my view of other people in the world, my locus of control, etc. So that's why it's so important for all of us in all of the various fields that you all described being in or going into, that we always approach our work related to kids and young people in child welfare with a culturally responsive, trauma and resilience informed, and a child welfare competent lens. We have to have all of this in mind. How many of you have heard of a trauma lens? How many of you? Can I see hands? Your virtual hands will work. Okay, I'm seeing some raised hands. So trauma lens is essentially a shift in perspective from asking, what's wrong with this child, to what has this child been through? Okay, what have they experienced? And it's also important that we move beyond just a list of traumas, okay? They had some traumas that might have brought them into the child welfare system. They experienced witnessing domestic violence. They were physically abused. A parent went to prison. They experienced immigration trauma. So they have all these traumas, but it's so important we move beyond that too, to the things we were just talking about. Because also they've experienced ruptured attachments. They've been moved off the chest of somebody that they trusted and who cared for them, and put in a completely unfamiliar, or at least a new environment, even if it was somewhat familiar. And again, that can happen over and over. A child's just not going to say to their foster parent, I'm just really feeling my grief today. So you might notice I'm acting out a little bit, not quite myself. That's not how kids are going to express this, right? But it doesn't mean they don't experience that grief and loss. And as adults in their lives, we have to be the ones who are aware and contextualize the really rich and sometimes devastating context of being involved, not only with trauma experiences, but within child serving systems. And we also need to think about, I know you all learned about the staggering disproportionality in child welfare, and knowing that all of that is critical to this context too. What's it like? What is the impact of the experience of daily microaggressions, of discrimination, of marginalization? What's it like for our LGBTQ plus youth who sometimes are in care by virtue of who they are, of their identity, and being rejected from their own family and multiple families over time? And so we have to have this combined lens when we go about our work in whatever our field is, because in child welfare, this is the best practice. And these are all of the components we have to think about. And as we talked about early on with the adverse childhood events study, we also have to not just say, move from what's wrong with this child to what has this child been through. We also have to ask, what's right with this child? What are their strengths, and what's going well, and how do we build off of those things? We have to move in all of our disciplines from deficit to considering even these behaviors as adaptive strengths. So for example, a behavior we see very commonly in child welfare is hoarding food. Now you can understand why a foster parent or a relative caregiver could be really upset. Let's say that a child's hoarding food under their bed. And so then they might be punished. They might lock the refrigerator so they don't have access to food. And in fact, that just triggers that deprivation need even more. Okay. Instead, being able to understand, wow, this is a child who was not getting fed, who didn't know that when they would get their next meal, and they developed this adaptive strength. They became resilient. They became resourceful and figured out that they could hoard food so they had it when they needed it. And maybe they were even hoarding food to give to their siblings or even their parents. Okay. So now we have a very different mindset around this child. This is an adaptive child with strengths. This is not a child who's damaged and has deficits and is difficult. And it's really important in whatever we're doing that lens is critical. We also need to focus on the wins. So I'll tell you a fun story from one of our resource parents at UCLA Ties. And so these foster parents took in boys who were 4 and 5, 2 siblings through foster care. And when they first joined their family in fostering them, the social worker said they experienced a lot of trauma. They thought that both of them might be intellectually disabled. They would likely need to be in special education, etc. And so as the oldest started kindergarten, just a couple months after joining this family, a few weeks in, they got a call from the kindergarten teacher. So she calls the resource mom, who answers. The resource mom's name is Allison. And the teacher says, we have a terrible problem. Sean has written his name all over the wall. Okay. Now she's been through all of our, preparatory training through UCLA Ties. She's got on her resiliency lens. So she tells the teacher, can I place you on hold for just one moment? And she yells to her husband, Mike, guess what? Sean can write his name. So being able to find the wins, even in those moments, of course, did they need to then shape where he was writing his name? Of course, but they were thrilled that he was doing something developmentally appropriate when they had been told sort of all of these terrible things that could be coming. Both of those kids, by the way, ended up in gifted and talented education. So the point is, we have to find the wins. And you know what? If any of you are parents or around children, you might know it's not always easy to find those wins, to find the positives. But when we do, it builds so much strength for kids, especially when we can name them. Also, as human beings, we all want a sense of connection and a sense of belonging. We just want to know that if we don't show up somewhere, we're going to be missed. And so there are great opportunities within families, within communities, within schools to let children know they have a place, that they have a role, that they're going to be missed. And even when I hear teachers say things like, I'm glad you're here today. I missed you on Wednesday. I can't wait to see what you do with this assignment. That means so much, just to be seen and to be heard for young people. It's also important that we name injustice, that we recognize that it is not, what they've experienced is not okay, and ongoing discrimination is not okay. And even that we help to empower children and young people and model it ourselves in terms of advocating against injustice and activism toward justice. And finally, I think in all of our fields, we have to move from just talking about stabilizing. You hear that a lot in mental health. We need to stabilize mental health symptoms, right? And in education, I hear a lot about catching kids up to grade level. My hope is a resilience lens is moving beyond all of that. We really are talking about children flourishing. We really are talking about families and communities thriving. So just something for you all to think about in your own fields. I know we don't have time today, but if this were more of the lens that we all took in our work and in our fields, what would that be like? How could that shift our fields? How could that shift children and families that we're serving? And what would it mean to us personally as individuals, ourselves, not just in our fields? And how can we start to integrate this idea of culturally responsive and trauma and resiliency informed and child welfare competent care in everything we're doing right now as you're doing research labs and you're taking courses and in your field placements? So this is just something for you all to start to think about. And I'm sure you've thought about it a lot, so I should say continue to think about. As we talk about healing, I think most of you are aware that relationships in young childhood serve as a foundation for a lot of learning and development. And so interacting with loving and nurturing adults is very essential. And so when a child's needs are being met, they then develop positive frameworks for other relationships that we all experience throughout our lives. And so this occurs when our caregivers are sensitive to us. And when they meet our needs, they are attuned to what those needs are and to our responses. And when there's consistency and when there's nurturing. And when infants are very young and children are very young, adults do a lot of co-regulating with them. So as I relax and use a calming voice, a child can do the same. I'm teaching strategies so that they become internalized, and then children are able to regulate themselves. Now, oftentimes in the context of trauma, some of this is missed in early life. In fact, instead, kids and young children are in that survival brain and spending more time on safety than they are on cognition and exploration in their environment. So our early relationships can really positively influence our brain development. And we know from the video we watched that our experiences early on can also cause other changes in our brain. So when trauma occurs, it often involves a sort of a betrayal of this sense of safety, okay? And so it involves a loss oftentimes of those stable, nurturing relationships, whether it's abuse that's occurring, whether it's neglect, not getting my needs met, whether it is the loss of a loved one to death, to incarceration, to deportation, to multiple military deployments, all of that type of loss, including death for children. So after experiencing trauma for any of us as humans, it shapes our interactions with our friends and our family and our colleagues and a lot of others. And so we might then carry with us this fear of abandonment in the future. It might impact how we think of ourselves in the world and our own self-esteem. And it may lead to us having difficulty with future relationships, including some difficulty trusting, particularly if we are starting to think that, okay, so the world is not safe and I'm incompetent to handle myself in it. And it is possible to repair these ruptured relationships. And in fact, relationships are a key piece of healing from trauma. So yes, relationships can be impacted by trauma, but supportive relationships, collective consciousness and healing, and community are really essential to healing and to building resilience over time. Relationships, we know, can help heal trauma at any stage. There are studies that actually show that brain connections become repaired when there are positive, safe, nurturing relationships and spaces. And it's important to remember that this can be any type of relationship. It doesn't have to be a parent-child relationship. And as adults, that remains the same. This could be relationships that are protective factors with our colleagues, with mentors, with our chosen family, with our friends and extended family, our partners, that as we create partnerships and relationships in the future, with our communities and with our pets. So connections and communities are really key to healing. And also, along with that collectivism is the empowerment and building advocacy to work against injustices that we've experienced and creating ways that to empower ourselves and those who have experienced trauma through activism. So I want to share this video with you, and I'll have you do a short exercise before we break today and Dr. Wong joins the conversation. So I will let this speak for itself with Dr. Angelou.
There's an African-American song, 19th century, which is so great. It says, when it looked like the sun wasn't gonna shine anymore, God put a rainbow in the clouds. Imagine. And I've had so many rainbows in my clouds. I had a lot of clouds, but I have had so many rainbows. And one of the things I do when I step up on the stage, when I stand up to translate, when I go to teach my classes, when I go to direct a movie, I bring everyone who has ever been kind to me with me. Black, white, Asian, Spanish speaking, Native American, gay, straight, everybody. I say, come with me. I'm going on the stage. Come with me, I need you now. Long dead, you see? So I don't ever feel I have no help. I've had rainbows in my clouds. And the thing to do, it seems to me, is to prepare yourself so that you can be a rainbow in somebody else's cloud. Somebody who may not look like you, may not call God the same name you call God, if they call God at all. You see? And may not eat the same dishes prepared the way you do, may not dance your dances or speak your language, but be a blessing to somebody. That's what I think.
So we're just going to take about 3 or 4 minutes, and I'd like each of you just to reflect on everything we've learned today. There was some heavy information. Again, this was just a high-level sort of overview, but I'd like everyone to think about who have been the rainbows in your clouds to get you to the point where you are in your life, in your education, in your studies, in your work that you're doing. And so I'd like each of you, this is just for you, you don't have to put it in the chat, but who have been your rainbows despite the adversity, despite the potential trauma? Who are your rainbows and who's gotten you to this point, and who do you carry with you as you are continuing in the work that you do? And I'd also like you to think about who in your life might need you as a rainbow And that could be something in the field work that you're doing. That could be someone in your personal life, someone in your dorm, someone that you'll be working with next fall. So I'd like to just give everyone a few more minutes just to reflect on your rainbows and how you've overcome adversity, and also how you can fill that role for others.
There's an African
Okay, hopefully closing with that reflection sort of gives you something to consider moving forward, that encapsulates some of the pieces that we shared today. I also know that we need to switch speakers, so I want to thank you all, as the slide says, for all of your attention and your time and everything that you're doing in your own lives to create the condition within which our communities, children, and families are stronger.